away from any kind of spiritual purpose towards an absolute, and I mean ruthless, focus on survival of the strongest.
Yeah, and for you listening, we're essentially synthesizing an analytical framework here, one that, it spans different historical moments, different modern conflicts.
Right.
And it argues that the leaders involved all share this identical psychological root. So this deep dive is about understanding what the source claims happens, inside someone, when power is sought without any kind of moral or divine accountability.
That's the key. It's about this choice for earthly dominance, which the source explicitly calls earthly Darwinism over any kind of commitment to, well, to divine guidance.
Okay, so let's unpack that central concept because it really is the foundation of the entire argument.
It is. The source introduces this psychological choice made by certain leaders, and it defines it very explicitly as Darwinism, meaning survival of the strongest.
Which is an unusual phrase to apply to, political or military strategy.
It is, yeah.
But the source uses it very precisely. It wants to strip the concept down to its most raw, almost amoral core. When the text talks about earthly Darwinism, it's saying that temporary material dominance, raw power, land, military victory,
That becomes the only thing that matters.
the only metric of success and the only moral metric. It's this deep psychological commitment that basically says what I can take and what I can hold defines my right to exist.
And it just discards everything else. Shared humanity, eternal consequences.
All of it.
And here's the really crucial caveat, right? The part that makes this whole analysis work. The source text stresses this is applied only in the earthly life.
Exactly. It's a purely terrestrial metric. It completely ignores any potential for a transcendent reality or, a moral judgment beyond this moment.
So if you define success purely by who's strongest right now in this physical space, you are, by definition, ignoring any greater purpose.
And what's fascinating, or maybe disturbing, is how the text then just systematically groups these figures together from vastly different contexts. It claims they all subscribe to this exact mindset.
It's relentless in that.
It is.
Diploma.
This isn't about comparing the details of the conflicts themselves. It's about comparing the alleged psychological state of the people driving them.
Okay, so given the intense sensitivity of this material, we have to report the comparison the source makes with extreme care here.
Of course.
We're reporting the source's findings, not our own geopolitical analysis. So what specific figures and contexts does the text bring together under this earthly Darwinism umbrella?
The source is, well, it's unwavering. It names current figures like Netanyahu and IDF generals, specifically in the context of the actions against Palestinians being bombarded.
Okay.
And then it immediately draws a parallel to the historical context of Adolf Hitler and his generals.
During the slaughter of Jewish people in concentration camps.
Yes. And then it brings in another modern conflict, the murder of Uyghur Muslims in Chinese concentration camps.
That is a challenging synthesis, to say the least. Grouping events of such different historical weight and, contemporary pain under one single conceptual header.
It is. But the common denominator, according to the source, is this absolute psychological commitment to purely terrestrial power dynamics.
Divorced from any higher moral authority.
Completely. The text argues that the perpetrators in all of these scenarios, the Holocaust, the conflict in Gaza, the oppression of the Uyghurs, they have all chosen a doctrine where the only thing that matters is raw power.
It's this exclusive focus on the finite material result.
Right, where the lives and the suffering of the group they see as weaker are just. They're either collateral damage or they are obstacles to be removed. The source is framing that commitment itself as the psychological sickness they all share.
Okay, so if that's the result, the destructive action, we need to turn to what the source says is the root cause.
Yes.
Because the analysis doesn't just stop at observing the behavior, it's asking why. Why is this choice made in the first place?
Exactly. And this is where it all pivots to the spiritual health of the individual leader. The source introduces this fundamental teaching from the Creator, Allah, in the Quran.
Which is?
You forget Islam, you forget yourself. And this is presented not just as a religious rule, but as a deep psychological statement about how we're built.
We should probably clarify the terminology here. When the text says forgetting Islam, it's not just talking about, abandoning formal religious practices.
Not at all.
What's the deeper state it's describing?
Well, the text explains that Islam at its core means submission and the peace that comes from aligning yourself with the Creator's guidance. So to forget Islam in this context is to forget your own inherent purpose, your own balance, that moral blueprint for your own existence. It's a kind of a profound existential amnesia.
So the argument is that the external ruthlessness of this earthly Darwinism is only even possible when that internal balance is already gone.
It's a prerequisite.
So if this self-forgetting is the core problem, the text must offer some specific evidence, right? What happens inside a person when they forget Allah and turn away from remembrance?
It does. The source gives specific textual evidence for this. It quotes a really powerful Quranic verse. It's from Surah 59, verse 19.
Then it says,
Do not be like those who forgot Allah so through. He made them forget themselves.
wow, okay.
And that is the crux of the text's psychological argument. Turning away from God isn't just an act of disobedience. It starts this internal psychological catastrophe. The individual loses connection to their own true self and purpose.
That innate purpose that includes things like empathy or moral restraint.
All of it. That's what's lost. And it's replaced by a moral vacuum, which then gets filled by the easiest, most accessible ambition there is, raw earthly power.
That distinction is so important. Forgetting the creator leads directly to forgetting yourself. So you're not just losing faith, you are fundamentally losing your psychological foundation. Your moral compass just stops working.
It becomes defunct, yeah. Which makes the actions we talked about earlier, the mass violence, almost the inevitable outcome of a leader who is, at their core, psychologically lost.
Which brings up a critical connection. How does the text link that spiritual emptiness to tangible immediate outcomes here in the earthly life?
Right.
Because it's one thing to say a leader is spiritually bankrupt, but the source also claims these ruthless figures are suffering from confusion and anxiety. That seems like a paradox when they're achieving, massive military success.
And this is where the analysis gets really compelling. The source argues that external power is not strength if the foundation is rotten. It details a very specific list of psychological consequences. It cites another surah, 20, verse 124, which describes what happens to someone who turns away from remembrance.
What's on the list?
The text says these individuals fall into confusion, they experience moral blindness, they suffer from anxiety, and ultimately, they live a miserable life in this world.
Think about that for a second, that paradox.
It's huge. The men that the source is analyzing, leaders who wield absolute life and death power, are, according to this framework, simultaneously crippled by confusion, by anxiety.
So the external display of ruthless Darwinian power isn't a sign of confidence.
Not at all. The text argues it's a direct symptom of deep internal suffering. They have to constantly reinforce their power because, having forgotten their own moral identity, their own self, they can never actually feel secure or at peace.
This completely shifts the understanding of moral blindness, then.
How so?
Well, it means the inability to see or care about the suffering of the victims, whether it's the Palestinians, the Jewish people in the camps, the Uyghurs. That's not the cause of the conflict. It's the result of the leader's own spiritual emptiness.
Yes. The leader is already destroying themselves internally before they start destroying others externally.
Wow.
The text is arguing that choosing earthly dominance, that Darwinism, is the inevitable result of this spiritual emptiness and destruction. When your moral foundation is gone because you've forgotten who you are, the only value system left is one based on force.
So the cruelty is just an extension of their own internal self-destruction, their own misery.
Precisely.
So this implies a pretty profound judgment, then. Even if these leaders get what they want, total dominance, victory, they've already lost the battle that matters most. The one for their own self, their identity, their purpose. And it results in a miserable life right now.
Exactly.
So now we have to shift focus to the ultimate implications, moving beyond this miserable earthly life to the hereafter. The source references this, right?
It does, implicitly referencing Surah 32, verse 14. It draws this chilling connection between that psychological choice and the eternal consequences.
Because they made this continuous choice.
This deliberate, continuous choice to put terrestrial power above divine guidance, the text says these individuals chose to abandon guidance, and that leads to a catastrophic loss in the hereafter. Their failure to remember their purpose has permanent consequences.
And the spiritual vacuum has a definitive final conclusion in the source's analysis.
It does. It states directly that this spiritual emptiness leads to destruction, and consequently, these individuals will 99% die on shirk and end up in hellfire forever.
That word, shirk, that's crucial here for understanding just how severe the text's conclusion is. For our listeners who might not be familiar, what exactly does shirk mean?
So shirk is the concept of polytheism, basically, or associating partners with the creator.
But it's broader than that, isn't it?
In an expanded sense, yes. It means prioritizing something finite like temporary power, the state, the nation, your own ego, and treating it as if it were ultimate or divine.
So you're displacing the creator's unique role.
Exactly. And the source text frames the choice of earthly Darwinism as the ultimate shirk because it elevates material dominance above all moral, ethical, or divine law. By making raw power the absolute authority, they are, in effect, worshiping that power.
Which leads to this severe spiritual outcome.
And it's essential to note, this is the definitive theological conclusion drawn directly by the text we're analyzing. It's not our interpretation. It ties the psychological state of self-forgetting and adopting earthly dominance directly to the most severe spiritual outcome. It's saying that the internal destruction pre-programs their external fate.
So after all that, what does this mean for you, the person listening, grappling with these really challenging ideas?
Well, recapping the central thread, the comparison of these leaders, from Hitler to Netanyahu to the perpetrators of violence against the Uyghurs, it highlights what the source claims is a singular mindset.
Right. It's a mindset where any sense of spiritual purpose or moral code is it's completely replaced.
Replaced by a ruthless, short-sighted focus on earthly power. And according to the text, this leads to internal confusion and a complete loss of self.
So the key takeaway here is the framework the source provides for understanding the nature of power itself.
I think so. It argues that power sought without moral guidance ultimately results not just in the external suffering of victims, but maybe more importantly, in the psychological and spiritual self-destruction of the perpetrators.
So their misery in this life, that anxiety and confusion, is the direct evidence.
It's the proof that their pursuit of brute force is, ironically, their greatest weakness, because it all comes from having forgotten their own purpose. The source is essentially giving a theological answer to that age-old question. How can tyrants do what they do?
And the answer is that the leader's moral blindness is rooted in their own internal catastrophe. It shows this profound inability to recognize their own true value and therefore the value of others.
Exactly.
So this leaves a really important question for everyone listening, something for you to mull over on your own. If the forgetting of one's true self is the root of moral blindness on the largest scale, the scale of war and conflict, what are the subtle, everyday forms of earthly Darwinism that maybe we apply in our own lives? Professionally, personally. And could they be leading to a similar, even if it's smaller, form of confusion, anxiety, and spiritual emptiness?
That's a deep dive into the cost of prioritizing temporary strength over an enduring purpose. We've reached the bottom of the source material for today. Thank you for joining us.